In this last video in our primer, we're going to put together everything we've learned in the past several videos into one program, and this program is going to basically allow the user to input student names and test scores and then print out what the average is for each of those students. So let's begin by defining a function that can calculate the average score based on a list of scores. So remember, when we're defining a function, we use the def keyword, and we're going to call it average score. And it's going to take one input, and that input is actually going to be a list of the scores. So even though it only takes one input, that input is actually a multi-valued input. It's a list. All right, and so for this function, I want it to return the average. And so the average is the sum divided by how many there are, right? So we're going to return the sum of the scores divided by how many scores. Now, if you recall, there's a built-in function called len that returns the length of a list. And if we have a list of scores, then the length of that list is how many scores there are. And so we're going to return the built-in function sum that adds all the scores divided by how many scores there are, which is the length of that list. So that's a pretty simple function, but it will work for any size list of scores. So if there are 3 scores in the list, it'll find the average of those 3 scores. If there are 5, find the average 5, because the length will always be correct based on the number of scores in the list. All right, so skill 1 done. We've written a function. We've used some built-in functions inside that function. We know about parameters and return values. Okay. Now I want to ask the user over and over again for student names and scores. And so maybe I'll do something like I'll ask the user for some input, right? Say data equals input. And we'll say, please enter the student's name followed by test scores. Okay, and we'll separate those test scores by spaces. Okay. All right. Notice I'm doing this in a new file, not in the shell, and so every time I hit enter, it's not actually running this. We'll run it at the end. Okay, so I want to keep doing this until they don't type anything. So I'm going to say while data does not equal, so this is a new operator, not equal is an exclamation point and an equal sign. Remember, if I want to know if something is equal to something else, I use the double equal sign. But in this case, I want to know if the data is not, and I've just put 2 quotes next to each other. There's nothing in between these quotes, not even a space. So while the data is not nothing, then we want to process that data. All right, how are we going to process that data? Well, I want to print out the student's name and then the average of the scores. But the problem is input always returns a string. So data is going to be a string. So let's just do an example in the shell real quick, just to show you what I mean. So if I were to say data equals input, type the name and scores, and I type John 48 95, he had a really bad day in that 48, 87, 89. If I look at data, it's just a single string with the names separated by the scores with spaces. And this isn't a list. I mean, it's a list of characters, but it's not a list of values, right? And that's a problem because I can't, this isn't a list of scores. It's got a name and these scores, and it's not even numeric, right? It's in between quotes, so it's a string. So the computer's not going to be able to process these as numbers anyway. But there's a new function, built-in function, that works on lists that I want to tell you about. It's called split. And if I type data.split, so split is a function of lists, or of strings, excuse me, of strings that creates a list. And so this split function looks at a string and breaks it up based on white space or spaces. And so the result of that, what it returns, is an actual list. Notice the square brackets of values. Notice the commas, right? So John is the first value in the list, 48 is the second, etc., right? That's much better, right? Because now I have this list of things. However, these are still strings, right? 48, 95, 87, and 89 are still strings because they're still in quotes. So I'm going to have to fix that as well. Keep in mind also, data.split returned a list, but data itself is still this string. So maybe we want to convert that. Okay, well, let's go back to the program. All right, so I've got data, it's a string, and I want to convert it to a list first off. So let's say data equals, data becomes, data gets itself split into a list. Okay, so after this, data will be that list. Now the problem is the numbers are still strings, so I can't treat them as, like this sum, for instance, won't work. Like let's try it. Let's see what happens. What I want to do is print out the name, right? So we'll print out, well, the name. The name is the first item in the list, right? And that was John. Look at, right? So how do we get the first item in a list? Well, we index the list. So data sub 0 is the first item in the list. Okay, and then I want to say has an average score of comma, and then I want to print out the return value of my average score function. Okay, but I want to send in the scores. Okay, now data isn't the scores, right? Because data also includes the name, like John. The scores only start at the second value, right? 48. Okay, so I want a list that starts at the 48 and ends at the 89. Well, we know how to do that too. We use a slice, if you remember. So we can slice the slice the list starting at index 1 and going to the end. Okay, so recall what this does, right? Takes the list data, starts at index 1 and goes through the end. And sends that list, remember that itself is a sublist. It's a list. It gets sent into this scores parameter. And so now scores will be populated with the list data from 1 to the end. That's pretty good. But like I said, we do have a problem. And that problem is that the data is not numeric. It's strings. So let's see what happens when we try to run it anyway. One last thing, once we're done with that, we'll repopulate data with the next person. Okay, so let's copy this, paste it, and this way I give the opportunity for data to become nothing again. So when the user's done entering people, all they have to do is hit enter instead of anything, and then data will be empty and the while loop will quit. Let's give this a go. If we run this now, it's going to define the average score function, and then it's actually going to run this code. So I'm going to run that, save it. Oops. Okay, so enter the student's name followed by the test scores. Okay, student's name is John, 48, 95, 87, 89. Enter. Okay, and we see we get a type error, right? This last line here. Unsupported operands for the addition int and string. So what it's saying is this sum function tries to add things and it can't because the sum, the scores don't add as numbers, and so we have a problem there. So what we have to do is get those numbers to be converted from strings to integers, and so to do that, we're going to use our other type of loop to kind of round out our skills here, our for loop, right? Now, what we want to do is change each of the items in data except the first one, because the first one is a string, it's the name of the student. So we want to say for I in range, okay, we want to run this so many times, and I want this to run, the range function to run from number 1 to the length of the data list. Now this is a slightly different use of the range function than we used originally. I told you in the previous video that for loops, when we use the range function, run a certain number of times, right? So if we did for I in range 10, I would take on the values 0 through 9. You can, there's another version of the range function that I have here that you can give it a starting value and an ending value. And so I will start at this value, go up to but not include this final value. Okay, so what am I trying to say here? I want to change all of the data that is numeric from strings to numbers. And what I'm trying to say is I'm going to go through the data starting not at the 0th position item, but at the 1 position item, the 48 in this case. And I'm going to loop through, I'm going to make I take on the positions through the end of the length of data. Well, what is the length of the data? Well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items in this list. So if I say 1 to 5, essentially, that makes this range take on the values 1 through 4 because it doesn't include the last value. Remember, a range function goes up to, but not including the last value. So this I will take on the values 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are the positions in this list, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4, because this starts at 0. All right, that was kind of complicated, but hopefully you were able to follow it. What do I want to do each time? I want to change the data in position I. Okay, so the first time I want to change the data in position 1, but I is taking on each of these values. So the first time we run through this loop, I is 1, and so we'll change data sub 1. Data sub 1 I want to be the integer representation of itself, right? Then the loop comes back and I becomes 2, and then data sub 2 is the integer representation of itself, right? And I'll actually show you this in the shell just so we can see it over here. Now I've already named this variable data here. If we run this and we look at data, notice what has happened. Originally, data was John in quotes, 48 in quotes, 95 in quotes, etc. Now it's John in quotes because we started at 1, not at 0. 48, the number 48, not the string 48, 95, 87, 89, etc. Because we've modified each element in each position to be the integer version of that value. Okay, so that's the purpose of this for loop. And now that we've done that, we can pass in that slice of the list, starting at position 1 and going to the end, into the scores, because now these are all numeric values being passed in. Let's see what happens when we run this now. Enter the name followed by the scores. John, 48, 95, 87, 89. John has an average score of 79.75. Great. Betsy, 98, 91, 84, 72. Betsy has an average score of 86.25, right? If I hit enter, the program quits. Why? Because when I just hit enter, data is empty and this condition becomes false because empty does equal empty, and so that the program ends. There's nothing else left, the program quits. Okay, so that's already our first program that kind of puts everything together that we've learned, dealing with lists and both for and while loops and defining functions and some of the built-in functions as well. So hopefully now you feel a little bit introduced into the Python language, and some of the Python code that you see in the future hopefully will make some sense to you. You know, as always, try to seek help if there's something that you didn't understand. And that's it.